Appreciation for the invitation to address you on this august occasion, a meeting of the Council of Ministers concerned with many critical issues. And within your busy program, I truly appreciate the invitation to address you as a member of Secretary General's Ban Ki-moon's management team and also as the Executive Director of an entity in the United Nations system that perhaps many of you may not have daily contact with, but what I would like to convey and share with you this afternoon is that as part of the UN family, as part of the Sustainable Development organizational infrastructure of the UN, UNEP represents, I think, both a relevant and an important part of what the United Nations has, does, and hopefully in the future can also contribute to your community of nations. As the chairman noted, I literally just landed from Durban, where I left last night, as governments were, as they so often are in the context of climate change negotiations, on the verge of breakthroughs and failures at the same time. And I do not want to pretend that I can bring you affirmative news yet of what will emerge, but I think there are a number of developments that, particularly from the perspective of African, Caribbean and Pacific nations, are extremely important. The expectations for Durban were relatively low, simply given the fact that for many countries the recovery of momentum after Copenhagen remains somewhat elusive in the climate change negotiations. But I would like to pay tribute particularly to the host nation, South Africa, which has not only valiantly but also systematically try to engage in a preparatory process that would allow Durban an opportunity to prove that, far from having the world walk away from the United Nations Framework Convention, as some have suggested, as being too slow, too unwieldy, unable to deliver breakthroughs, perhaps the world will need to take a second look. Very likely in the outcomes of Durban today, by this evening hopefully, will be the establishment of a Green Climate Fund. There has been significant progress made on that front, and as you all know, this is a critical building block after Copenhagen and Cancun to give credibility to the fact that we have an international climate policy partnership. There are still design questions, for instance, where such a fund should be hosted, what the transition phase would be, but throughout the last year, under the chairmanships of Norway and South Africa, a transitional committee has designed the core elements of this Green Climate Fund, and you will recall that roughly $100 billion a year is the target of resourcing this fund by the year 2020. And clearly, for both an accelerated set of actions by developing nations and also the support in terms of the adaptation agenda, this is a critical building block. However, the dark cloud, if I may put it that way, hanging over Durban was what happens to the Kyoto Protocol, which is of immediate relevance to all of your nations, and clearly also, particularly being here in Brussels, at the heart of, let's say, the engine behind the Kyoto Protocol, the European Union member states, or Europe, let's say, speaking more largely. In having failed in Durban, in Copenhagen, to have arrived at an agreement, clearly the world is now in a mode of improvisation because the Kyoto Protocol is due to run out very soon. There are a number of industrialized countries who have either never joined or are now signaling that they're not interested in a second commitment period unless all nations become part of the protocol. I think we have seen in the last 24 hours, and again I think it is perhaps a good signal, with the leadership of the European Union committed to finding a way to maintain the principles of the Kyoto Protocol in very intense negotiations and discussions with, for instance, AOSIS, the African Union, but also some of the emerging economies such as China and Brazil, to find an agreement that would allow the international community to maintain some of the principles of the Kyoto Protocol, while at the same time also finding a means by which other nations may in due course join an international legally binding agreement. Just in the last 24 hours, Brazil and China have signaled their willingness to consider such options, possibly with a view to 2020. What has to be resolved by this evening is whether there is sufficient consensus on how such a bridging solution could look, And here I come to a fact that particularly for many of your nations that are island nations has been of particular concern. The world is simply not acting fast enough on the challenge of mitigation and reducing emissions. And UNEP published in the weeks just before the Durban meeting a report that has been cited particularly by member states at Durban, but also by many organizations interested in climate change. It is called the Bridging the Emissions Gap Report. I do not want to go into detail, but three numbers are, in a sense, an explanation of where the world is right now. By any reference to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to stay within a 2-degree scenario, even as a possibility, we would have to reduce global emissions to a level of 44 gigatons by the year 2020. Today, we are at 50 gigatons, and with a business-as-usual scenario, we would not be at 44, we will be at 56 gigatons by the year 2020. This would be a certain verdict on the world having no opportunity to stay within the 2-degree boundaries, never mind the 1.5 degrees that many AOSIS member states have asked for and called for, and an increasing number of scientists are also advocating. In fact, the WMO published just before the meeting in Durban a report that found that for the year 2010, the world had in fact reached the highest levels of emission concentrations ever in the atmosphere. And we know that the world is far from having reached the point where it is actually reversing that trend. So if we were to simply go on until 2020 negotiating and then begin to act, for many of your countries it would be the worst case scenario that has been described by so many of the international scientists and experts. And that is why what happens in the next 6 to 8 or 12 hours in Durban is very critical to the future of your international approach to climate change policy negotiations and also international relations. I would also like to point out that in Durban we see something occurring that is not unique to the climate change negotiation, but that is beginning to occur in many of the international negotiating processes, be it in the context of trade and the Doha round, be it in the United Nations more generally, such as the Commission on Sustainable Development, or be it in the climate change negotiations. A sense of paralysis, a sense of not being able to achieve breakthroughs, and at the same time also developments in terms of what were traditional positions of negotiation. There clearly is, and this is important from your perspective, I'm sure, an increasing divergence between the European and North American positions. There is no question that in Durban that divergence was no longer hidden behind negotiation language. It is quite apparent that Europe is choosing to walk a different path to the current positions being articulated by the United States and Canada. But it is also evident that within the G77 it is becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile some of the positions and interests between emerging economies with very different infrastructures and different footprints in terms of their energy and industrial sectors, and some of the least developed countries, small island states. And that also is creating a new series of challenges on how to align positions, how to form negotiating processes that would allow consensus to emerge. I think very importantly, we should also note that contrary to much of what is being said in the international media, developing countries are today already significant contributors to emissions reduction. Brazil, most likely over the last 2 to 3 years, by reducing emissions from deforestation in the Amazon, has probably achieved the single largest mitigation action of any nation on the planet by absolute numbers of emissions avoided through the significant reductions in deforestation. China has already exceeded its own targets in terms of delinking economic growth from emissions growth beyond anything that it would have had to promise in Copenhagen. We see countries in Africa, such as Kenya, where UNEP is headquartered, investing in a major green energy strategy which will allow it to double or triple the electricity generating capacity of its economy, currently at roughly 1,300 megawatts, probably to 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts in the next 6 to 8 years, by largely relying on the expansion of geothermal and wind power development, therefore not adding in essential CO2 terms any further emissions to the global atmosphere. We have just seen the announcement in South Africa during the COP by President Zuma of a major green economy strategy for South Africa, which has within it also a sustainable energy initiative of a very significant dimension in changing also the future trajectory of South Africa's energy infrastructure, because perhaps not known to you, South Africa is today the 12th largest emitter of CO2 by virtue of its energy infrastructure and its reliance on coal, and quite a dirty coal in terms of carbon emissions. So we can look across the continents, and what we see is that a significant amount of action is underway, and this is really my lead over to the second focus of my presentation to you today, which is the Rio+20 summit and a general understanding that we need to look at some of these issues that we are today trapped by in international negotiations from a broader perspective. I believe one of the reasons why we are struggling so much in the climate change negotiations is that here is an environmental change phenomena as a result of industrialization, of pollution, that is essentially triggering a fundamental shift in our economies across the planet. This is not a localized phenomenon. We are not dealing with an environmental issue in terms of a river basin or one forest. We have collectively been able to affect the fundamental life support systems on the planet, starting with CO2 emissions, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We are also faced with unprecedented challenges in terms of food security and the future of agriculture and food production on the planet. We are destroying at record levels arable land every year on the planet, while faced with an increase in the population just in the next 40 years of another 2 billion people. In fact, we have added another 1.5 billion people since the last Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And if you go back to the year 1900, we were 1.5 billion people. What is becoming increasingly obvious is that we are living in a world in which the management of our resources and the management of the essential life support systems, atmosphere, biosphere, productive land, water resources, the oceans, biodiversity, fisheries, are all at the point where you could argue their maximum utilization has either occurred or is on the verge of occurring, and the world is not beginning to redesign its systems of production and consumption in such a way as to enable a world population of 9 billion people to succeed in developmental terms. In fact, many of the environmental challenges that we face today are increasingly threatening the viability of the basic right to development. They are also threatening our economies with an increasingly high profile of risk and vulnerability. And therefore, I wanted to address you this afternoon in terms of the Rio+20 summit from a perspective where we no longer allow the notion that economic development must always come at the expense of environmental sustainability, and vice versa, the notion that achieving environmental sustainability and development will always exert a price on economic opportunity. This is a luxury that perhaps the 20th and the 19th century were able to sustain on this planet. With 9 billion people, the resource productivity of our planet in the coming years is no longer an open-ended envelope. In fact, if you look at the decline in fisheries, the decline in forests, the pollution levels in the air, we are reaching points where our greatest challenge today is how to assure development opportunities for, first of all, the 7, 8, 9 billion people of the current and next generation, but also beyond that. And I believe that when we look towards Rio+20 in June of next year, I would particularly, given the portfolios that you represent here, propose to you that we should not look at Rio next year as a summit about, if you want, a kind of esoteric discussion about sustainable development in the future. In fact, the discussions in Rio next year, I would equate more to a summit about the world economy. Because given the current financial crisis, but also given the challenges of climate change, given the continued and pervasive nature of poverty in the global economy, the levels of unemployment in our countries, it is essential that Rio next year not be viewed as an abstract discussion about the future of development, but as my colleague Juan Somavia often calls it, about the crisis before these crises. And these crises are essentially about the kinds of economic and development models that our nations in very different contexts and with very different responsibilities are pursuing, but all collectively are beginning to pay a price that is both, in the end, unpayable and also a great risk to our societies. At the heart of next year's discussions in Rio are two themes that the General Assembly resolution for Rio has determined. One is the green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. The other theme, the institutional framework for sustainable development. I believe it is no coincidence that member states have chosen these two themes because they speak to two increasingly obvious challenges that we face. The economic model of the last 150, 200 years is increasingly under pressure and some would argue faced by recurrent crises. At the same time, the design of our international institutions for cooperation and for handling these issues are increasingly also considered by some to not be up to the task. Some would say anachronistic. And therefore, the reform also of the multilateral platforms for international cooperation alongside the economic agenda are taking center stage. Now, as you, I'm sure, are aware, the discussion about the green economy has been one that has received in different parts of our international arena and in the preparatory process to Rio, let's say, at least some mixed debates. At the heart of this work, I would simply like to share with you two or three aspects today, which I hope will give you the confidence that, in fact, this discussion in Rio is of immense importance and relevance to each one of your countries. The first one is, in view of the facts that I briefly touched on where we are heading with the planet and the resource base that is available to us, we need to look at how we can trigger a greater resource productivity in our economies. Resources are becoming scarce. They are becoming also more volatile in terms of the global markets, and therefore every country must have an interest in also looking at a more efficient and more optimal use of resources, be it in terms of energy, be it in terms of land, be it in terms of water, or indeed minerals and metals and other resources that are found within national territories. The transition towards a green economy essentially is focused on two parts. One, greater efficiency in the sense of industrial and infrastructure development, be it energy, transport, buildings, cities, whereby we can achieve the same amount of unit of lighting, kilometer of transport, with less resource use and less pollution. It is the only way in which we can envisage a climate-safer future, but also a more resource-stable future. The other part is one that has been often neglected in recent years, but touches on many of your countries in an immediate sense, and that is what we often call today the ecological infrastructure. Our systems of national accounting, our economic instruments, have never really been able to attach values, economic values. Forests are viewed at best in terms of their timber value when harvested. As my colleague from Kenya, I don't know where the distinguished representative of Kenya is, but one of the very interesting studies that led to a significant shift in Kenya's policy was an economic valuation of the contribution of its water towers, the four major hill regions, the watersheds of Kenya's economy, most prominent amongst them the Mao forest. For that single forest ecosystem, an economic valuation, and this is not in any way magic economics, pure economic services provided in terms of water, power, microclimate for the tea industry, tourism and agriculture, was found to be $1.5 billion per annum to the Kenyan economy. Now, that is a number that will make every finance minister and every prime minister and president sit up, because if you look at the fact that this forest was, through excision, degazetting, illegal land use, essentially going to be destroyed in the next 15 to 20 years, you can imagine how the perspective on conserving this forest ecosystem has changed Kenyan economic assessments of these four water towers, fundamental to the future of water supplies to the economy. The result was that in the new constitution, in fact, Kenya has a new clause that now commits the country to re-establish a 10% forest cover for the entire nation, which is an increase of 8% from the current 2%. But the examples go further. If you go north into Ethiopia, and the current policy of development in Ethiopia, and I would urge for those of you who perhaps have a particular question, how relevant is the green economy to Africa, for instance? Prime Minister Zenawi recently published an article in which he asked, what is the relevance of the green economy to Africa? And I must admit, I could not argue it in any way more clearly what the connections are between the future of Ethiopia's development, including its commitment to become a low-carbon and ultimately carbon-neutral economy, and an ability to return to managing resources that are within the national jurisdiction of a nation. And this is something that applies particularly in the context of the future of energy. For much of the developing world, particularly least developed countries, and certainly in Africa, 2/3 to 3/4 of the population still don't have access to electricity. The future of the African continents, but also of many other countries, electricity infrastructure can either be one that is based on fossil fuel, making Africa both vulnerable and liable to world market fluctuations and import of fuels and fossil fuels, except for the few countries that are privileged enough to have those resources, or to invest in a renewable energy infrastructure that takes advantage of indigenous resources that are available today. Now, in the past, many nations did not have both the capacity or the priority to look within their boundaries of how an energy infrastructure of tomorrow could look. Now, again, taking an example from Kenya, because it is one I follow most closely every day as I happen to live there, is that when Kenya began to examine the amount of wind potential within its borders, it was surprised, as were many international observers, because in fact for many parts of Kenya, particularly in the Turkana region, but also other parts, the wind power potential for development is higher than North Sea offshore, which is considered to be one of the most competitive in the world today. And as a result of a policy measure that Kenya took at the time, not because of any international condition, development, aid program or anything else, namely the introduction of a green energy policy and a feed-in tariff, literally within 12 to 18 months, a consortium of Kenyan and international partners with the government established a project in the Turkana region, which is now ready for development, of the largest wind power farm on the African continent. 350 megawatts, that is roughly a quarter of the existing infrastructure, to be established over the next 3 years. Following that, there are now 6 to 8 other international ventures looking at wind power development in Africa. I have not even gone into the geothermal potential, which is a very central part of the development. But I also mentioned South Africa, and I also urge that for many of the island nations, the opportunities for looking at energy infrastructure development from another perspective have become critical. But, and this is why the discussion in Rio next year is so important, I would argue, from an ACP perspective. The green economy discussion of Rio is not about prescribing or imposing conditionalities in environmental terms. I think all of us in the United Nations are very clear that this is not about standard setting that would, in one sense or another, dominate, determine or dictate from an international perspective what a national development strategy looks like. I also want to emphasize that we are very clear from the Secretary General to many of us, including my colleague Shah Zukang, myself, that the green economy discussion is not about trade restrictions. And yes, many of you deal with this issue every day, and let us not pretend, whether you are in the brown economy mode, green or pink or yellow, there will always be the temptation by countries to use trade negotiations to achieve advantages. I only want to emphasize this is not unique to a green economy agenda. It is a reality of nations engaged in a competitive and sometimes difficult international negotiation process. But from an ACP perspective, what Rio could deliver is 3 critical elements that at the moment will prevent many of your nations from being able to make progress. And they relate to technology, finance and capacity. Not unknown issues in the international negotiation, but central to the ability particularly of smaller nations to progress. Because, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the transition towards a green economy in the global economic context is already underway. And if you look at the European Union and you look at the resource efficiency investments that are taking place here, then Europe clearly views its competitive advantage in future in being able to produce superior products and achieve a price advantage by reducing its resource consumption, because it cannot improve labor productivity more. So in Europe, I mean, you walk into the Commission, I spent the morning there again today, there are massive programs that are investing in a green economy transition in Europe. Investment in renewable energies, investment in recycling, investment in efficiency, investment in transport sectors. But it's not only in Europe, it is also in North America and, ladies and gentlemen, it is also in many of the emerging economies. China today is, from my perspective of what I have been able to understand and participate in China, possibly the fastest moving country in looking at the potentials for transitioning to a greener economy as part of its domestic but also its international position. But also countries such as Brazil and South Africa. I mentioned President Zuma's Green Economy Plan just announced this week. The emerging economies equally, from both a domestic perspective and an international perspective, view this work as critical to the future viability and opportunities for their economies. But where does this leave the least developed countries, the smaller economies that do not have the finance, that do not have the technology, and often do not have the capacity? It is here that I believe that in Rio there is a real opportunity, and that is why also the ACP gathering for me today was a vital opportunity to address you, to move to Rio with a distinct understanding of what it is that your nations need to or would like to obtain from Rio. Because in Rio there will be negotiations, not necessarily funding negotiations, but we need to find a way in which the international system of cooperation, be it through ODA, through export credit guarantee finance, through public-private partnerships, is more attuned to the needs of least developed countries and the countries that you also unite under the ACP banner. Because if that is not the case, then many of your countries will struggle tremendously to try and make these transitions happen at the pace at which they are happening already in many parts of the global economy. And that is why I would venture to say that as you look forward today, whether you are foreign ministers, whether you are trade ministers, development ministers, infrastructure ministers, economy ministers, the notion that some of the issues that we have in the past discussed in terms of an environmental, an economic and a social dimension is something that belongs to the 20th century. The future of our economies, whether highly industrialized countries, least developed countries, is no longer subject to the old matrix that first let's invest in the economy and infrastructure and then let's sort out environmental issues. In fact, if you look at today's economy, environmental issues are increasingly a driver for innovation, for efficiency, for diversification. I gave you the example of energy systems, also for cooperation in terms of technology transfer. And that the challenge perhaps that we have in Rio next year is to achieve a sustainable development focus that allows us to bring the economic development imperatives into a far closer and intelligent relationship with environmental sustainability and also social equity, and not to trade them off against each other. And I say this to you, and I know for some of you this may initially produce a skeptical reaction. I do not have the opportunity this afternoon to speak to you in detail about this. I simply would urge you to ask your staffers and your ministries to take a close look at something we have just published and released last week in Beijing. It is a green economy report. It is something that can break your foot if it falls on you. I apologize for that, because it is 600 pages, but it is the textbook of today about how countries across the globe from all continents are implementing not pilot projects, not the small village project to show that if you have enough money you can do anything, but that is looking at the 10 major sectors of our economy: transport, energy, urban infrastructure, tourism, industry, of how countries have put policies in place to make these transitions happen faster and successfully. In that sense, it is a resource book. It is as much also a knowledge platform that will continue to evolve. But it has examples probably from even many of your nations here, because these transitions are not happening in only large countries, they're also happening in small countries, some that are very rich in natural resources, some that are very poor in natural resources. They also speak to the fact that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. Every country, every economy will have to calibrate its own strategy. But again, my key message to you is that the discussions next year in Rio are essentially about a global economy that is subject to greater and greater risks as a result of shortages, resource constraints, vulnerabilities such as climate change and food security, the future of agriculture, and that these transitions have become an imperative globally speaking, but also an opportunity. And that is really the major message. Addressing these issues as an opportunity is what Rio should really be about next year. Not about legislating, not about one part of the world telling the other part of the world what to do, but a global compact, if you want, of how nations can help each other. And climate change has been an extremely important and helpful phenomenon here, because it has made the largest economy of the world realize that even if it shut itself off, it cannot solve the climate change problem alone. And equally, it is also becoming clear that for developing nations, notwithstanding the historical legacy of emissions, if China, India, Brazil and many other nations don't become part of the international effort to manage climate change on a timeline that is viable but also fair, we will not be able to stay within the 2-degree limits. And for some of your countries, Excellencies, that means you may not be here to attend an ACP meeting 50 or 60 years from now. It is that dramatic a reality that we are confronted with, and the world is still too slow to appreciate that there are points of no return. That is why I also believe that as a grouping, and I would appeal to you to look at the Rio Summit next year not as just another conference. This is a conference where the interests of nations such as yours need to be center stage, and the rest of the world community begins to appreciate both its responsibility but also the opportunity for working together. I end by just touching very briefly on the other major theme, which is the institutional framework for sustainable development. I deliberately chose to focus on the green economy today because I think it makes a lot more sense in terms of the agenda here. But our own United Nations system is also reaching, in many respects, a point at which its utility and its efficacy in convening the world and finding consensus solutions is under severe stress. And the sustainable development governance arena since Rio has not been a great success story. The Commission on Sustainable Development is viewed by many with increasing frustration. Equally, the environmental governance arena is one where I think most countries now feel that as a result of hundreds of multilateral environmental agreements, a kind of dissipation of effort. And for many developing countries, even the participation in these international processes is becoming prohibitive in terms of the time and the money that has to be invested in it. At the same time, we do not really have an environmental governance system today because it is so atomized, and UNEP, which has its governing council, is a council that only has 58 countries on it. It does not even have universal membership in this day and age. And its decisions are subject to approval and endorsement by the General Assembly, which means that the ministers of environment of your nations are not able to exercise environmental governance in the true sense of the word. They meet, they make proposals, but unlike in the health domain or in labor domains and in other areas of international policy making, their decisions have no real locus standi. If you accept that environmental issues are becoming increasingly defining to the future of economic and social equity issues in the international context, then addressing these issues is a priority. And that is why both the reform of the Commission on Sustainable Development, possibly with a new council as is proposed, and also the option of strengthening environmental governance, including the possibility of turning the current platform of UNEP into a specialized agency and therefore a governance platform that is more aligned with other major areas of the UN, are issues that are on the agenda. I will not dwell further on this. I would just urge you, particularly as Ministers of Foreign Affairs also, to take a close look at this, because the discussion is one that merits attention, and in the submissions that have been made for this process, over 125 nations have now called for such a specialized agency. But as always, these issues need to be looked at from many different angles, and I'm sure will continue to be discussed right after Rio. But that would be my appeal to you, that these options are kept on the table so they are considered in the total context of sustainable development. Mr. Chairman, Secretary General, I end by just emphasizing how keen we in the UN system are, and my colleagues from UNDP as well as other agencies who I met this morning wanted me to convey to you how much they believe that the discussions that you would be able to bring to Rio matter to the future of this summit. And particularly we in the United Nations Environment Programme, who already work with many of your countries, particularly on this green economy agenda, very much hope that as a result of our agreements and the partnerships we have begun, that we can intensify this work in the years ahead. And once again, I thank you for the opportunity to address you here this afternoon. Asante sana.
Thank you, Mr. Steiner, for that comprehensive briefing. We look forward to, I don't know if we're all looking forward to it, but I guess the 600-page report that you said, we look forward to having to scan through some of it, and I'm sure everybody will get a copy, one way or the other. I would have thought that after at Durban they would not have issued a 600-page report. I thought they would send it electronically, but
it is available electronically, and a summary.
Well, there you are, using the old methods and the new methods. So for those who have still not caught up with change of times, they'll get the hard copy, and those who are now on the .com mode, they'll get it electronically. But thank you very much. Thank you very much for taking time out, flying all this way to give us this brief. I am sure the ministers, ambassadors, and the delegation here are highly grateful of this, and they've taken, I think every one of us take serious note issues of environment these days the world over. I would ask you indulgence, because I would like to, in this climate of freedom of expression, democracy, good governance, I'm sure there are others, they would see, some people on the floor would like the floor to ask you a question or give you some observation. So without stifling the democracy, may I open the floor for comments and observations, please, if any. Kenya. I thought you're going back to Kenya.
But we meet everywhere.
Okay. Okay, you wanted to know where the Kenyan delegation is. The Kenyan delegation is right there. Kenya, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to assure the Director that we are represented here. Chair, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Director for that very elaborate presentation on the issue of the green economy agenda. And also I would like to thank him for illustrating his case using Kenya as an example, particularly on the key areas that we have embarked on. The projects that he mentioned, for instance, the Mau reforestation, I must say that it is very key in terms of changing the Kenya's climate environment, because before we embarked on this reforestation, clearly there was danger that our economy will over time grind to a halt. And therefore, we are very seized with this project, in addition to the geothermal and wind power which he mentioned, and we really appreciate the support which we have gotten from UNEP, and will intensify the efforts in the coming years. And therefore, I would like to assure the Director that Kenya will play its part in contributing to the greener economy agenda. And also, I invite all the other members present here to join in this noble cause, because it is our survival that is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenya. Yes, Zambia, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and also to thank the Executive Director for that elaborate submission. I think as we're discussing this matter in relation to our economic relationship with Europe, could we have an understanding of the positions of Europe and the United States as major contributors towards the pollution issue? Where are they standing, and where are ACP countries expected, what are they expected to do in terms of addressing this issue? And whether, in fact, even if the ACP countries were to address themselves to these issues, they can make a difference to achieving the 2%, within 2% increase on the emissions. Would our efforts be sufficient, or do we need to ensure that the bigger economies that are doing even more pollution have to be on board, like from what you stated, Kenya as an example, or indeed for that matter, the bigger economies like India and China? I would like us to understand that. Many of us here are doing commerce and trade and industry, and so to that extent, we may not fully appreciate the issues of how we are, in fact, injuring the very environment in which our industries are operating. And I would find it very helpful if we were advised of how the others, what role they are playing. Because from the statement, I'm also hearing that there are those that are holding back, thinking that they can contain this challenge on their own. How are we positioned vis-a-vis those economies, Europe and United States? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zambia. I'm going to invite Mr. Steiner to answer the question from Zambia. And I think Zambia now represents all our views, because unfortunately, Mr. Steiner has got another assignment he has to go to. So after he has responded to Zambia, then we'll allow him to leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I believe that the positions in the climate change negotiations are a particular arena, and clearly here industrialized countries are still struggling with the fact that in total emission terms they have a very significant responsibility to lead the effort. I would say the United States and Canada have begun to take, or have taken in the past, a very much more reluctant and passive role in addressing these issues. But even in the context of the United States of America, for instance, there are many states that are in fact beginning to act on the climate change and mitigation issues. So the story is not as singular as it may appear. And remember, a state like California is the 7th largest economy in the world. Therefore, what happens in California is probably the equivalent of 3 or 4 European countries acting. But I think overall, clearly, the United States is at a point in time, and this is an unfortunate situation, where the science of climate change is not the center of the debate. The problem is that America finds itself paralyzed in the Congress because climate change is an issue of ideology in terms of the role of the state. That is my interpretation, because climate change demands a greater intervention by federal authorities in regulating energy markets and emissions. And this is a fundamental conflict in the domestic American debate. I think Europe deserves some credit for having, first of all, made commitments, and by all the monitoring data available today, the 20% emissions reduction by the year 2020 is on track. And Europe, in fact, is on the verge, and unfortunately 2 or 3 countries objected, but this may still change, of even increasing its commitment to 30% emission reductions. So 1/3 over the 1990s level to the year 2020. And that may well be an outcome if Durban goes well and an agreement emerges. Then it could well be that Europe would increase its emission reductions. But that does not yet solve the overall problem. But I think we will have to continue, and the world will in the end have to reach the kinds of emission levels we are talking about now, which would require by 2050 an 80% emissions reduction in the European and North American industrialized world. These are very significant changes in the global economy, and particularly here. But if I may end by simply saying, within that context, what is becoming very clear, that it is not only the external rationale that drives perhaps the agenda for investments in more energy efficiency, renewable energy. It is actually also a domestic development agenda, a domestic international competitiveness agenda. Uganda, for instance, is a remarkable country in the sense that it invested significantly in the expansion of organic agricultural production for export, as a result of which 200,000 farmers have now been trained in these methods, and their premium on goods that are exported is not insignificant. It is a way of positioning yourself in the global marketplace that a normal small-scale rural household would not have had in that sense before. And I would give you, could give you many other examples, as I said in that report, but just to reassure you, for your consumption, if you, and I will ensure that you will receive this, there is a 20-page synthesis of this report, and I'm not suggesting to you that this is the only thing to read, but I think you will be astonished by many of the things I've only been briefly able to touch here this afternoon, of how viable and how successful some of these strategies have been by your countries, by your economists, by your power and utility companies, but they need to be looked at from a political and a development potential. It is not only an environmental legislation issue. And that is my key message, that in terms of Rio next year, these issues are about the future of development rather than about the constraining of development processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steiner. He has allowed just one more. He has allowed Uganda. Uganda, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation, sir. Among some of the emerging economies, we are faced with a challenge on whether to decide between industrialization or environmental issues. We're trying to generate electricity. We're trying to grow palm oil. We're trying to grow coffee. We're trying to grow sugar and all that in order to industrialize our country. But sometimes when you try to clear some of these forests, red flags, environmental issues. But in Europe, where are all the forests? In America, where are the forests? I think there is a disparity in policies. When shall we reach the level of industrialization? If we prioritize environmental issues. That's the challenge we're faced with some of our emerging economies. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
Minister of Commerce and Industries.
Yes. Minister, I would simply respond to you in the following way. The forests that you say, where are they in Europe and North America? It's a fair question. I mean, one could argue there are many and they have paid a lot of money to reforest. But the example I gave you of the Mao forest, imagine the reality is that if you cut those forests down, it is not that they are just an environmental abstract value. In this case, it meant that an entire hydropower station that had been built in order to power industrialization could not be commissioned for 3 years because there was no more water left in the river. And therefore the value of the forests, and this is all I'm saying to you, sometimes it is worthwhile cutting down a forest. I mean, nobody would say that trees are holy, or I would not say this. But in the name of development, very often ecological infrastructure is cut down because it is considered to be of no value to the economy. And this is a grave mistake, particularly in countries where rainfall patterns and the climate change reality is going to make water an ever greater constraint. I also want to give you an example. I mean, in the name of industrialization, Africa to this day has not been able to provide 3/4 of its population with access to electricity. But it is an increasingly vulnerable situation in terms of its land, water, and production resources. I will only say to you, the investment in renewable energy, instead of cutting down forests or, for example, flooding forests in the name of hydropower, for instance, is one that is, on the verge of being absolutely economically viable for many African nations. And if you look at decentralized energy systems, we know that in Africa, electricity is perhaps another 10, 20, 30 years away because the infrastructure is prohibitive in terms of the cost. decentralized off-grid solutions with photovoltaic and solar power systems are not some remote opportunity. And I say this with the full conviction because we have just built, and this was very much something I wanted to do on the part of the United Nations, leading by example, a new headquarters in Nairobi for 1,200 staff. It's a building designed and built by Kenyan companies. On its roof, there is a photovoltaic installation that provides the power for 1,200 staff members working in that building. It will pay for itself in 9 years' time, and then we have another 15 years of free electricity, because the installation is guaranteed for 25 years. My point being, we need to broaden the range of opportunities. The difficulty for photovoltaics and wind power to, for example, provide power, which is fundamental to industrialization, is not a matter of economics anymore, Excellencies. It is a matter of financing. How do we get a small household to replace the electric geyser they can't really afford with a solar water heater when it costs $1,500? We need to bring the banks in, we need to bring the utilities in and lower the threshold. The same is true for larger scale installations. But I would also say to you, many of your countries will spend millions of dollars on feasibility studies for example, hydropower dams and hydropower stations. It will take you somewhere between 5 to 10 years to build a maybe 500, 600 megawatt infrastructure. You can commission a photovoltaic power station today from the point where you order it to where you have it installed and it is functioning, producing power in less than 6 months. And it is our economics and our institutions and our ministries are not rethinking the models that they apply to looking at the options. And all I'm saying to you is there are many more options, but your own institutions, and we are by training in our universities, by tradition, so narrowly focused on traditional approaches that we are missing many of the opportunities that are right here. I'll stop here. As you can see, I could give you many more examples, but I hope that I have at least how do you say, increased your interest in a reality that is being missed by many developing country institutions because they consider it beyond their reach. And this is a tragedy for many developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steiner. I'm sure that you recognize that the 80 countries in the ACP it's a big number. I'm sure that partly the reason why you came to give us this brief, because the number is enormous in terms of its impact on the environment. And I will invite you to Kampala to continue with my dialogue with my minister.
Will she receive me?
Definitely. But I wish you all the very best in your other assignments and duties. Have a safe trip back to Nairobi whenever you're traveling there. And on behalf of the ministers, ambassadors, and the delegations, and everybody in the ACP, I thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure to meet you, Minister. And we will hopefully see each other then.
Yeah, inshallah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best. Okay. Nice, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All the best. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I don't know whether I've got the correct. Because I have so many.
Don't worry. I will just. Colleague ministers, ambassadors, I beg that and pray we resume with the business that we adjourned on this before lunch. Before lunch, there were people, countries, and representatives who wanted to make contribution on the unfinished business on agenda number 11, and they were responding to the report on the Development Finance Corporation. And on my book, and I have Mauritius here as one of the countries, Mauritius, South Africa, Jamaica. So let's take those three first. Mauritius out. Mauritius out. South Africa, please. South Africa, no. Okay, Jamaica. Okay, then we'll have Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. Jamaica, you have the floor.
Thanks, Chairman, and I shall be quick. Again, we're thankful.
Can I ask people to sit down, please? Less movement. Jamaica, please.
Thanks, Chairman. We're thankful for the report. The one point where I would want to make, though, on behalf of my minister, is that while we see significant documentation, significant evidence of the EU's position on various in both the budget support and their development plan, the agenda for change. Since it was in fact an exchange between our ministers and the representatives of the Commission, what we would have liked to have seen a little bit more of in the report is how our ministers and their duly appointed representatives reacted to what we were told. If I may, just to focus as an example, more so on the agenda for change, we made quite a few points. For example, Jamaica made the point that where you let me give you one quick one, Minister, for example, on the budget support, where there is now increasing a requirement, there will be a requirement for countries to report on issues of fraud, where there's any suspicion of issues of fraud or corruption. And we do believe that one has to be very careful. This should have, you should have empirical evidence before, in other words, if I suspect that my colleague has done anything wrong, I'm going to start telling the entire world without the evidence. So we think we have to be very careful. So in other words, we just wanted to alert each other so that we can look out for some of these things as they are going to come up. With respect to the agenda for change, for example, there is an increasing emphasis on including the civil society, the non-state actors. And that while we acknowledge that that is very important, the truth is that there are myriad of these NSAs, civil society, NGO organizations. How does one determine which of them should be consulted? In my own country alone, there are 2,000 registered ones. So when we are moving towards implementation of a program, we hope that that process is not going to be impeded by that kind of consultation. We see, for example, that there is a proposal to invest in drivers of growth and jobs. This means that there has to be some important exchanges with the private sector. Has the EU looked at the modalities for ensuring accountability and so on? Because hitherto they have been accustomed really for that kind of disbursement of funding through governments. We also see that there'll be a focus of aid on countries most in need. But we haven't seen, well, hitherto throughout the development cooperation process, any focus on countries such as mine and many of us in the ACP group of the highly indebted middle-income countries. And so we would like this, although the EU has acknowledged that there is going to be a differentiation of approach, we would love to see how all of this is going to be developed, particularly in the context of the dialogue that they're speaking about, political dialogue and policy dialogue. So that we need to know what the modalities, the nature, the scope of that dialogue. Well, it will take care of some of these concerns. So, Chairman, what we would really love to see, and I hope we noted that our EU colleagues were taking copious notes as each of our ministers took the floor. We hope that the Secretariat did that too, so that when we come back to discuss these issues with our EU colleagues towards implementation, that we will have properly documented so we can share our experiences. But it is important for us to record that. Finally, Chairman, I'm very sorry that we allowed the EU representatives to leave before we were asked, we sought their views on the outcome of Busan, the Forum on Aid Effectiveness. But I would say for the purposes of this forum that our governments should really now keep a little tab on the extent to which this new agenda for change will be aligned to what we have collectively agreed in Busan. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Jamaica, for that highlight and for expressing your concerns on issues relating to agenda for change. I'm sure many of my colleagues here have a similar experience to Jamaica, with a number of civil societies and NGOs in their countries, and sometimes one wonder which is which. I think similarly on the issue of corruption, we have to be extremely careful in pointing fingers before we have substantive evidence as such. I recollect, I do not know where this came from, but I was in Perth recently, and this seems to have been, and my brother from Vanuatu was there, and he agreed with me that this seems to have been taken, this has been extracted from the documents that were presented to us during the CHOGM meeting in Perth. I don't know how ACP and CHOGM is related, but I'm sure the EU countries can explain it. Some of the members of the EU who are in CHOGM would explain it to us. Thank you very much. Maybe now we could move to Trinidad and Tobago, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also would be brief. I wanted to, first of all, endorse some of what my colleague from Jamaica has indicated. And I think that there is need for ministers to place great importance on a very detailed examination of that Agenda for Change document, because I think it's a game changer, particularly bearing in mind the austerity measures that are being imposed within the EU on their very citizens, and those very citizens and the EU institution stakeholders have in fact been insisting that in the utilization of the funds provided to developing countries that they are impactful, but it has also influenced the way they approach the ACP, and I think that we're seeing it not just in terms of the trend towards divide and rule, not just in terms of the EPAs, but also within the area of development cooperation. And that very document, Agenda for Change, attests to that. Now, having said that, I wanted to revert to the question of the midterm review and objection made to the very mention of the possibility of reallocation of the unutilized funds to other regions. In this House, we speak a lot about solidarity. And I think that the committee, we should take a page out of the Committee on Sugar. There's a reality that was recognized among the membership of the committee that some countries may not utilize their full allocation. And if you look at the proposal, which we would consider later on, the resolution, the draft resolution, para 4, operative para 4, deals with that issue, and it speaks about the need for flexibility in implementing the accompanying measures, which are the funds provided to sugar producers, to allow maximum disbursement of allocated resources and to make sure that all resources will collectively utilized and not forfeited. I think that that is an important lesson that we in this broader council must take to heed, and be within the context of, for instance, take no offense, but one region having as low as a 5% commitment rate in the midst of undergoing a midterm review, and that very region has an allocation of almost 600 million euros. We can't ignore something of that nature when there are other regions in Africa and Pacific, in the Caribbean, where the allocation is much, much smaller. less than 50%. And I think we must be realistic and we must be flexible, because we face the reality with an allocation of almost 600 million. We face the reality of the majority of those funds going back to the EU. So let's take solidarity to heart. And I also wanted to indicate that the sugar producers have been flexible, and I think that we would all benefit as a group if we show that sort of solidarity and flexibility. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Trinidad and Tobago, on that contribution. Once again, Trinidad and Tobago has raised the issue of the matter of agenda for change, and she has highlighted the matters therein. And I would urge that this is something we should, as a council, actually look at exceptionally carefully. Maybe it should go back to the working committees to look at critically and be brought back to the ministers with a comprehensive recommendation on some of the hidden intentions and innuendos and within it. I don't know what the Secretary can say about that.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, le secrétariat voudrait donner toutes les assurances à Madame l'ambassadeur de Jamaïque que les discussions sur l'appui budgétaire ne sont pas épuisées. Le secrétariat a déjà inscrit dans les conclusions de ce comité le mercredi que cette discussion figure à l'ordre du jour du comité ministériel conjoint ACP-UE qui aura lieu au mois de mai-juin prochain. Les discussions d'hier étaient conçues dans le cadre d'un échange de vues de haut niveau et de diffusion d'informations venant de la Commission. Le secrétariat, en temps utile, produira les documents nécessaires puisque nous avons déjà traité de l'appui budgétaire dans plusieurs réunions du sous-comité, mais cette communication a amené un élément nouveau qui porte sur la notion de contractualisation. Donc les critères anciens existent, mais cette notion de contractualisation mérite un examen plus approfondi, et parce que quand vous rentrez dans ce type de contractualisation, nous pensons qu'il s'agit de type de contrat OMD. Et les contrats OMD, lorsque nous les avons examinés, il n'y a que 7 pays qui ont pu accéder aux contrats OMD. Parce que là, c'était des contrats, c'était une période de 6 ans, ce qui n'est pas le cas dans l'appui budgétaire classique. Et nous sommes en train de vérifier pourquoi ces contrats n'ont pas fonctionné. Mais à première vue, nous sommes enclins de dire, d'abord, ces contrats OMD n'ont été dirigés que sur les pays les plus performants. Et qu'à cette période également, l'appui budgétaire n'avait pas atteint les mêmes proportions qu'elle a aujourd'hui au niveau du 10e Fed. Ça, ce sont nos premières conclusions préliminaires. En ce qui concerne la société civile, il est prévu dans l'accord de Cotonou que l'ordonnateur national et le chef de délégation vont établir une liste de la société civile qui vont avoir accès aux ressources du Fed. Comme vous le savez, il y a deux façons de voir. Il est prévu que la société civile peut accéder aux ressources nationales jusqu'à concurrence de 15%. Mais c'est vrai que pour qu'une telle organisation puisse accéder à ces ressources, il faut l'accord préalable de l'ordonnateur national sur la base de la liste conjointe qui sera dressée. Nous nous sommes rendus compte en fait que parallèlement à ce mécanisme Cotonou, la Commission, de par ses propres ressources, finance certaines organisations non gouvernementales. La deuxième révision de Cotonou a essayé de corriger cet état de fait en invitant la Commission à informer le gouvernement concerné de tout financement sur budget commission octroyé à une organisation, à une ONG travaillant dans le pays concerné. Donc là, c'est une question de suivi, et ça, je le dis sous le contrôle de Mme Raymond, dont ce volet dépend de son département. Trinidad et Tobago a parfaitement raison. Elle a parfaitement raison. Je crois même, madame, que certains éléments de cet agenda pour le changement sont mis en œuvre dans certains cas. Ils ont anticipé. Et c'est un sujet aussi, je l'avoue qu'au niveau du secrétariat, et je vous présente nos excuses, nous sommes un peu en retard sur l'examen de cette question. Mais cela sera fait en temps utile. Et je crois que cela sera le deuxième point clé que vous aurez à discuter au niveau du comité ministériel conjoint lors de sa prochaine session. Et ça vous donnera l'occasion également de réitérer vos positions au Conseil conjoint. Voilà un peu comme nous essayons de faire. En ce qui concerne la réaffectation des fonds, c'est le paragraphe 10. Il y a plusieurs possibilités où des propositions seront faites, soit pour utiliser les reliques, enfin, le montant qui sera déduit, soit dans des projets dans la région elle-même, soit dirigés vers d'autres régions. Donc, en général, nous faisons cela dans le cas où une région a développé une capacité d'absorption importante, mais ce n'est pas le cas pour le moment, ou alors il revient dans le FED. Alors, à ce niveau-là, je voudrais vous donner deux précisions. Au niveau de la revue à mi-parcours, les fonds dégagés sont encore des fonds FED. Ces fonds reviennent dans le panier FED et font l'objet d'une réallocation sur base du comité ministériel CFD conjoint recommandé au Conseil conjoint. Ça, cet argent n'est pas perdu. Mais lorsque nous allons entreprendre la revue en fin de parcours, tout reliquat, tout montant qui sera dégagé revient aux États membres. Donc nous n'aurons plus accès à cela. Et je saisis cette occasion pour attirer votre attention sur le fait que nous avons traîné, ils ont traîné sur la revue à mi-parcours. Dans le calendrier qui était prévu, vous devez commencer les revues en fin de parcours en 2012, c'est-à-dire l'année prochaine. Donc vous voyez, vous êtes en train de faire deux exercices très complexes et très difficiles dans un laps de temps très court, et il pourrait y avoir un chevauchement par rapport à la conclusion de ces revues. Voilà un peu, madame, dans quel sens je pouvais faire droit à vos observations, mais il reste important, et je crois qu'il faut qu'on l'apprécie, qu'une des sanctions des revues, que ce soit au niveau national, que ce soit au niveau régional, une des sanctions, c'est de réduire en fonction de la capacité d'absorption. Mais je vois là que dans le paragraphe 10, ce n'est pas l'option essentiellement choisie. Donc peut-être qu'il y a un travail à faire et votre secrétariat le fera à travers le sous-comité en temps utile. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Secretariat, for that clarification. Comesa? Is that Comesa?
Comesa in Zambia.
Merci.
Then we'll have that Guyana. Guyana and then Zambia, then I'll close it. I'll close this debate.
Merci, Excellence, Monsieur le Président, de m'accorder la parole. J'avais demandé la parole avant que je n'ai la réponse du secrétariat, mais je pense que le docteur Koulibaly a essayé d'apporter certaines clarifications sur une des propositions qui venaient d'être faites sur la question de réaffectation des fonds au niveau régional, parce que la revue à mi-parcours concerne actuellement les régions. Et je pense qu'on avait à le dire, et dans les documents qui ont été distribués par le secrétariat, il y a un rapport de toutes les régions ACP qui sont réunies ici et qui montrent où se trouvent les difficultés. Si les régions, certaines régions aujourd'hui, n'affichent pas un taux d'absorption satisfaisant, ce n'est pas de la faute des régions. Ce n'est pas à cause de l'absence des projets dans ces régions. Les régions ont plutôt appelé à la souplesse et aussi au travail conjoint entre l'Union et les régions ACP pour pouvoir utiliser ces régions, plutôt ces fonds. Les fonds qui sont donnés, ce n'est pas forcément, si on n'arrive pas à les utiliser, que c'est beaucoup de fonds. C'est des fonds qui sont décidés sur base des programmes indicatifs régionaux discutés au niveau des différentes régions. Donc, les différentes options ont été proposées et s'il arrivait que lors de la revue en fin d'exercice, des fonds ne soient pas utilisés, les États membres de ces mêmes régions ont des projets qui peuvent être financés et je nous proposerai à ce qu'on n'ouvre pas des brèches à des interprétations peut-être qui pourraient plutôt venir même affaiblir nos régions respectives et je vous remercie.
Thank you, Komesa, for that. I know what Eko was going to say. I know exactly what Eko was going to say. Eko, you had a chance, and you're going to repeat yourself on the same issue, I'm sure. Okay, 1 minute, Eko.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Tout juste 1 minute. Vraiment, soyons solidaires et unis ici. Il ne s'agit pas de déshabiller Paul pour habiller Pierre. Les montants du PIR sont des montants qui ont été discutés, acceptés sur la base des programmes. C'est de cela qu'il s'agit. Vraiment, n'allons pas devant les Européens pour dire qu'il faut déshabiller Paul pour habiller Pierre. Je vous en prie. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, ECOWAS. Thank you, Komesa. The Secretariat take full note of what Trinidad and Tobago has said. Similarly, take full note of what ECOWAS and Komesa has said. And we'll find a middle solution to that. Could I have Guyana and then my brother from Zambia?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Very briefly, I just wanted to add something that was raised in the discussion that could be relevant for paragraph 10, and as the Secretariat says, they intend to amplify on it. Namely, it was said that the committee agreed that factors accounting for the low level of commitment in some regions should be identified and adequate urgent resources provided to enhance the capacity. So prior to going to reallocation, we must look at the factors why there is such a low level of commitment, address those, and try to lift that. And that could be incorporated in paragraph 10. I'd like to also suggest in dealing with paragraph 16, where this dubious concept of contracts and also good governance contracts are being introduced, since good is very judgmental and implies good or bad, my suggestion is to look at improved governance, because we should avoid going into good or bad, but improving governance, and we all want to. So improved governance could be the focus of the concept if we introduce a contract. The other point that was raised in our discussion, and I think it came from the distinguished ambassador of Malawi, is that even though the concentration was on the regional medium-term review, we asked about how soon and the timetable for the intra-ACP midterm review, so that whatever is remaining from there can be identified and adequately provided for needs that Committee of Ambassadors have identified as priorities. We should not overlook that, because we're repeatedly saying ministers come, they advance action plans. I cited the example of the management of mineral resources. I could cite fisheries. We could cite several others. And we do not put behind those action plans adequate resources. And we said we could find within the intra-ACP the means by which this can be done. So I just want to commend that to the reconsideration of the Secretariat as it amplifies the document. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guyana. Secretariat, you've taken note of that. Lastly, Zambia, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I would like to acknowledge the statement by Guyana and really take that as also Zambia's position. In the discussions, it was quite clear that there may be some agenda which is up the sleeve in making this proposal of the so-called strategy for agenda for change. Having said that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to suggest, and this is really in reaction to what the Secretariat has said on the strategy side, in negotiating with our colleagues on the other side. I want to submit, Mr. Chairman, that rather than wait until mid next year, when documentation has been made, as has been seen traditionally, makes it much more difficult to negotiate when a particular partner has taken a position. It is therefore imperative that as we engage, before we have any formal agenda for change documented, it is important that the issues are raised immediately. There was also a question when we discussed this in committee of this so-called absorptive capacity. In an environment where there's so much shortage of resource, the question of absorptive capacity cannot be questioned. It is the procedures, it is the conditionalities, it is the requirements that could be responsible for the inadequate utilization of and access to these resources. And I therefore want to entirely endorse Trinidad and Tobago's initial submission that at the very meeting on Monday, the question of the agenda for change and the issue of absorptive capacities must be raised before they are formalized. Once formalized, we have a polarized position which might be much more difficult for us to reverse. I therefore suggest, Mr. Chairman, that as a matter of strategy, the Secretariat should include that as part of our menu, which has been circulated to all of us, that we really need to engage with our partners, that this issue of judgment, which is one-sided and not an engagement in any sense of the word, really cannot be tolerated, and that we really need to redefine that approach. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Zambia. Once again, Secretariat, the issue of agenda for change has come up, and the issue of absorption capacity. I can see ECHO was nodding their head. It was music in their ears. Thank you very much. I think that brings the end of that matter. Unless Secretariat, you got one last minute? Nothing? Okay, we proceed. Thank you very much. The next item, we are now in C. 12, item number 12 has been dealt with. We now move to D, adoption of decisions and resolutions of the 94th session of Council of Ministers. I believe everybody got copies of decisions and resolutions. We will go through them expeditiously.
Page by page.
Page by page. Hmm?
So the first one, yeah, is that one.
Yeah. So we'll do the decisions first. We have 9 decisions and 3 resolutions. The first decision is decision number 1. On the 7th summit of the ACP Head of States and Government. No amendments. We adopt it. There is, what's that?
Equatorial Guinea.
Is that Equatorial Guinea?
Yes.
What one?
No. Oh, Ghana. Okay.
Ghana. Ghana, please.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Just hold Ghana, please. We are addressing the draft resolution number 1, 7th summit of ACP Head of States and Government. Are we together?
Yes, sir.
Is everybody together? Ghana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, on this decision number 1, on where we have bullet 1, that is to recommend to the Bureau of the Summit of the ACP Heads of State. Towards the end of it, we have the summit to be convened in the latter half of 2012. Ghana wished to call for a slight amendment there. That is, we would like to delete the latter half of. And so we have the sentence reading 7th Summit to be convened in 2012. Our reasoning is that in 2012, as we all know, it's a very important year for Ghana. Ghana would be holding an election, and the president, President J.E.R. Tamils, would be very much engaged during the latter half of this of the year. And so we are calling for possibly allowing the Secretary General to be given some space to consult with the two presidents, the President of Ghana and the President of Equatorial Guinea, to determine more suitable dates and timing for the process so that he can adequately participate in the process. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Ghana. We take that amendment into consideration. So we amend it? Huh? Sierra Leone?
Mr. Chair, I just want to endorse what Ghana said. In fact, we shall also be having our elections on November 17 next year. So we need extensive consultations, not between the two presidents, but across the continent in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Sierra Leone. Any more elections next year? Kenya, December next year as well. So we take note of that. Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Kenya will be having elections. Secretary General, you have to consult with the head of states of Equatorial Guinea and Ghana and all the other head of states ASAP. Angola as well, I'm told, is having elections. These are serious matters. So the
just a slight amendment.
The slight amendment, we adopt it with amendments. Huh?
Yes, just to remove the word bureau, to recommend to the summit of the ACP, not the bureau. I don't even know.
Where? You want another amendment?
Oh, yeah.
Recommend to the bureau of the summit.
Just a slide. We are not recommending to the summit, so it should be. If I can make.
There is. May I draw everybody's attention to the same draft decision, right at the bottom, number 1. There's a need for some additional adjustment. Let me ask the Secretary General to read that out clearly, so that we are in unison.
So one hereby decides to recommend the convening of a summit of ACP heads of state and government at a 7th session in 2012. If I may repeat, to recommend the convening of the 7th summit of ACP heads of state and government in 2012. Number 1 would thus read, to recommend the convening of the 7th summit of ACP heads of state and government in 2012. Of course, the exact time will be subject of consultation as is contained in Part 3. Thank you.
Equatorial Guinea, I thought you had agreed already. No, Equatorial Guinea?
No, it's Sierra Leone.
Oh, Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, please. Sorry, Equatorial Guinea.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think I have issue also with number 3. If you say in consultation with 2 presidents, then you are leaving out the other presidents. What we want to emphasize here is extensive consultations, not necessarily with 2 presidents, but most of the presidents. We have to look at number 3 again. It's not too, I'm not comfortable with it at all. If they agree on a date and time and modalities, what about the other presidents if they don't agree? And we don't want a repeat of what happened in Ghana, as we are told this morning in 2008, where only 3 presidents attended. So we have to look at number 3 as well. Thank you.
Okay, Jamaica, please.
Yes, thanks, Chairman. With respect to the same paragraph 3, we believe that more appropriate terminology would be to say, to instruct the Committee of Ambassadors to propose a central theme and not to select, because the final decision would have to be made by the heads themselves. Well, through Council. Thanks, Chairman.
I've been advised by the Secretariat that the other except for the amendment by Jamaica, the other it should remain as it is, because once the 2 head of states have agreed a date, the Secretary General will continue to encourage and other head of states to ensure that they do attend, taking into consideration that of those countries that will be having elections later in the year.
Chairman, I think you misunderstood. I'm not talking about the date. I'm talking about the theme. Not the...
Yeah, that's been captured. I said except for the amendment by Jamaica, the rest remains the same. Sierra Leone.
Mr. Chairman, that's not the way it operates. Even at the level of ECOWAS, before a date for summit is agreed upon, the chairman of the summit normally consults with all his colleagues to find out an appropriate date. But if you say with the agreement of 2 presidents out of 80, it will be difficult, I'm telling you. And what we want here is maximum attendance by our heads of state. So what I want to recommend is the use of the word extensive consultations amongst the heads of state. But don't leave it to 2 presidents. If you leave it at 2 presidents, it will come back to say, or to actually find out that not many of the presidents will attend. Because next year, about 4 or 5 countries in West Africa will be having elections, and nobody will leave their country in the midst of elections just to go for a 1 or 2 day meeting. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Sierra Leone. Yes, the intention here is that was that the 2 head of states proposed several days, optional days, and then those several optional days will be used to go to intensively consult the other head of states that the proposed days are these. We have 5 days. Can we reach a compromise amongst 80 of you, which should be the best date? Taking into consideration the fact that some of you will be having elections next year. But take a note, I think, to take the concern of Sierra Leone, please could you amend it to reflect that there will be extensive consultation somewhere.
Okay, yeah.
This, Mr. Secretary General, could you please read the proposed amendment of number 3?
3. I'm sorry, if I might go over it again. To instruct the Committee of Ambassadors to propose a central theme for the 7th summit, a date, and modalities. In consultation with President of the Republic of Ghana as current chair and President of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, who shall in turn consult their colleagues.
Extensively.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Extensively.
Their colleagues.
With their colleagues. Okay, so I suppose we have.
And the Secretary General is going to brush it up. The Secretary General, Sierra Leone has not heard it clearly. Could you repeat that, please? Okay, Jamaica.
Suggestions along the lines of what I see the Secretary General is trying to do. To instruct the Committee of Ambassadors to propose dates, propose a central theme for the summit, dates and modalities following initial consultations with, and you put the President in office and incoming President, so that we understand that is the context in which we'll be consulting those persons. So if we say initial consultations, it means that they would give you some idea of what the possibilities are, but it is clear that it would have then to be a relatively collective decision-making process. Some wording along those lines. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, so... Yeah.
We're going to put this one in the work. Then just do it.
Yeah, so I have it.
It's not really in
we're going to, I'm afraid we're going to have to appeal to Honorable Minister from Sierra Leone. There are some real protocol issues coming up here. And also there's a question of the text. See, in terms of the text for summit, the text is really just telling us that the intersessional period, the summit shall be coordinated by, that's coordination. But the protocol problem is what? Now, this is a meeting of ministers. We have to be careful what language we are putting in there. Ministers cannot be asking heads of states to consult. In practice, that's what will happen. But, we can consult with them and then a decision is made, but the implementation of that decision will necessarily entail consultation with their colleagues. But if we leave it as it is, we're saying who shall also, I mean, we're going to be mandating heads of state to consult, which protocol-wise, and I'm advised well here that it's really not the elegant way to put it. So if we ask, we understand the spirit of it, and to be frank with you, this is something even in the corridors we have already taken up with Equatorial Guinea regarding what to do to ensure that there's maximum attendance. And I try to share some of this experience with ECOWAS, that there has to be, very active consultation to find out what dates are going to be suitable. So in practice, that will happen. But to put it in a resolution may be going a little too far, protocol-wise.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. I think we are now all together, Sierra Leone included. May I propose that the 7th Summit of ACP Head of States and Government decision as amended be adopted. Decision number 2, the discharge, decision number 2, discharge to the authorizing officer for financial year 2010. Adopted with no amendments. Draft number 3, appointment of external auditors for financial year 2011, 2012, and 2013. Jamaica, is okay? It passes without amendments. Adopted. Draft decision number 4, job classification and salary scale review of the ACP Secretariat. Zimbabwe?
Jamaica.
Nothing. Okay. Jamaica?
Thanks, Chairman. I am mindful of the specific mandate of the Honorable Ministers that the job reclassification and salary scales they had agreed to verbally should be phased in. And we know that the draft text here doesn't make that provision. So the proposal is to add a new paragraph 4, which would read something along these lines: to phase in the new job classification and salary scales over a period of 3 years, commencing no later than 2013, and mandating the Committee of Ambassadors to develop a timetable in collaboration with the Secretariat to take care of the provision for a phasing in. Thanks, Chairman.
The amendment is noted from Jamaica on decision number 4. So number 4 will be adopted as amended. Is that okay? Fine. Let's move to number 5. Staff regulations of the ACP Secretariat. Zimbabwe.
Mr. President, I just wanted to
find out whether on preamble paragraph 2, where having regard to the headquarters agreement signed between the ACP group and the Belgian government, does it have a year when this was signed? Perhaps we just add headquarters agreement of, is it 1974 or 1992, whatever it is?
1993.
Thank you.
So this decision is adopted with the relevant amendments. Number 6, draft decision, Social Security for local category members of staff. Adopted. Number 7, post of utility driver of the ACP Secretariat, Zambia. Number 7.
Chair, no, before we leave number 6, Chair, I was
The
just
first
going
number
to,
6 already.
yeah, due to the amendment made by Zimbabwe, it will have a consequential effect on the subsequent ones that are quoted. Again, here we have said, having regard to Article 23 of the Headquarters Agreement, then we have to subsequently set the amendment that has been made in the previous one. Thank you, Chair.
Well done, Zambia. Thank you. That's so 6 is as adopted as amended as well. Now, draft decision number 7. Adopted. Passes. Number 8, ACP Secretariat Budget for financial year 2012. Jamaica.
Thank you, Chairman. We're mindful of the very gracious offer of the government of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea to host the summit in 2012. And indeed, now we have left it a little bit more flexible in 2012 because the initial thinking when the issue was discussed was to look at the second half of 2012 because of mindful of the cash flow, likely cash flow problems with the Secretariat having to pick up a lot of the tabs. But in the context of the very gracious offer of Equatorial Guinea, we believe that that would now call for some adjustment to the budget accordingly. And so we would just, I think, honourable ministers may just wish to ask the Secretariat to make that adjustment.
Let's Zambia and then Sierra Leone, please.
Mr. President, I beg to submit that that is not actually the case because the provision in the budget did not include the hosting of the Heads of State Summit. In fact, in the text of the body of what we discussed, this was a concern that had been expressed. So I don't think that this will in any way affect the figures that are here because that was already excluded and it was outside this ambit. So I beg to submit that Jamaica's submission really does not fly. I thank you.
Sharon, please.
Mr. Chairman, I was going to say that even if the figures for the hosting of the summit were included in the budget, I think it would be premature for us now to expunge them since we do not know exactly the tab the government of Equatorial Guinea would take. So if the figures are included in these ones, let us leave them there until such time we are clear over what Equatorial Guinea will take. Thank you, sir.
I've learned that there was no the position of the budget standards. Zambia did explain that there's no provision, and caution had been thrown in the air that that if the summit.
I think Sierra Leone's position is correct. There's provision, but it's safer leave it than to take it out, and then if we have to encase them. Yeah.
The Secretary advised me that even if it had been budgeted for, only until and when the summit takes place in its conclusion, then we'll be home and dry. Otherwise, it's safer to leave it as such. Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, given the serious economic situation facing many of our countries, I do not think that we should be taking a decision on a budget and speaking in terms of ifs and perhapses and so on. Can I have clarification, please, regarding whether the proposed budget that was put before this council did include any element of the cost for the summit before we make a decision? Thank you.
Let me ask the Secretary General to respond to that. Secretary General, please.
Yeah, I think it would be very helpful to clear the air. The decision that the Committee of Ambassadors recommended to our ministers was to hold a summit with a budget, an amount that was included in the budget that was presented to you. To hold it, because it was a subject of specific discussion. This is how much it will cost should we have a summit. If we agree we should have a summit, it should be included in the budget. And that's exactly the decision that was adopted by the Committee of Ambassadors and presented to you. Your approval of the budget therefore meant that that amount is provided for in there. We have also the case where Equatorial Guinea is offering to host and is also offering to provide some assistance. I think, frankly, the position of Sierra Leone will be the safer one. Let us keep the budget as is, and of course, based on the support that we'll get from Equatorial Guinea, it will determine how much of what is programmed will be utilized. But to remove it completely may expose the Secretariat to certain hardships which we may not be able to handle in the process of implementing your decision to host the summit. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. Could I have, what's that?
Equatorial Guinea.
Equatorial Guinea, please.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Quiero, ante todo, agradecerle a este ilustre foro el haber dado a Guinea Ecuatorial la confianza de poder organizar la séptima conferencia de jefes de Estado de ACP. Hemos indicado que vamos a mejorar los servicios a fin de que las experiencias vividas un poco negativas en otros momentos no se vuelvan a realizar. Efectivamente, indicar con lo que concierne a la financiación que si bien mi país está dispuesto a financiar, obviamente eso no significa un cheque en blanco. Hay términos bien establecidos en convenios que van a ser firmados entre Guinea Ecuatorial y la Secretaría de ACP, que ya presentan los términos de financiación. Entonces, sin embargo, una conferencia tiene muchísimos otros gastos, algunos de ellos gastos administrativos, que tienen que realizarse aquí en la sede. Entonces, es de muy poco conocimiento de organización presupuestaria si no se tiene en cuenta aquello. Por lo cual, la propuesta de decir vamos a tomar una provisión, yo creo que es por de momento la mejor. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for that clarification. Equatorial Guinea. Zambia still? Zambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's clear that we have a difference here in terms of what was presented in committees and what is being stated here now. May I ask that the Secretariat point out to us where that provision is made in this budget? There is no provision according to these terms. There's no provision whatsoever. If what we're following on Guinea-Bissau's submission is to be followed, sorry, Equatorial Guinea, I beg your pardon, is to be followed, then what we should be doing is making a provision. It is not appearing in those figures at all.
I think the confusion may be coming from the fact that what is presented for the decision is a summary of headings, not a breakdown of every item. The budget that was presented to you with specific figures had a column for the summit with an amount. What we have here is just a summary of headings, member state contributions. It's in there. EDF contributions, income from taxes, arrears in contribution. But a breakdown of member states' contribution includes, of course, salaries, conferences, but also the summit, Honorable Minister.
Is it that?
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah, it was on page 6 of the document on Summit of Heads of States, ACP. So in the detailed budget, which we are not looking at now because that debate was yesterday, on the detailed budget, a provision was made for, because that was the decision, that was the recommendation from the Committee of Ambassadors who looked at the detailed figures. Thank you.
Zambia is still something? You still got your...
The flag.
A flag, okay. I get... Shall we say that is now clear to everybody? And we adopt it? So the draft decision number 8, ACP Secretariat Budget for Financial Year 2012 is so adopted. Decision draft number 9, acquisition of a new headquarters for ACP Group. Zimbabwe number 9 or number 8?
Number 9.
Number 9.
Thank you, Mr. President. Following the theme that Honorable Sishinga he muted about profits, and when you look at this aspect, we have processes that are taking place. There is the future of the group on the one hand, and the practical aspects that have to take place concerning housing the Secretariat and all that is related to the business of the Secretariat. And of course, the third aspect being the winding down or winding up in 2020. My question is maybe hypothetical, I don't know. When we talk about the plans that are in place looking for accommodation, when we are beginning to wind down, I don't know whether that makes sense. What we do, we have a new building, and in 5 years, we are packing. It's a question that we have to deal with. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Zimbabwe. We did have a debate on this matter yesterday, I believe. and a decision was taken that we do proceed with the prospects of a new headquarters. So I cannot open a debate on this matter anymore. Here we are dealing now with the draft decision, and I can only invite any amendments to the draft as it stands. So since there's none, we Zimbabwe.
I'm sorry, I'm just again following the theme that then I would be John the Baptist shouting in the wilderness. But please, we are in your hands.
Thank you, my brother, for that cooperation. I am very, very grateful. Thank you. With that, ladies and distinguished ministers, ambassadors, excellencies, we now move to resolutions. The first resolution. The first resolution is on bananas. It passes adopted. Thank you. The second draft resolution is on sugar. No amendments. It passes as adopted. What do you do? And lastly, no. Thirdly is on cotton, draft resolution on cotton. Burkina Faso. It's adopted.
One has been circulated on EPAS.
And
huh? One has been circulated on EPAs.
Yeah. And lastly, there is another. The last one is the draft resolution on the EPAS EPA agreements. Finally, Botswana.
Mr. Chairman, a small point on paragraph B, whether in the second line, the words on the EPA process are really necessary. And of course, on the first, these are EPA negotiations, not negotiation. We could do with an implementation in their respective regions, not on the EPA process.
Amendment is taken note of. Thank you very much, Botswana. We're grateful. Mauritius, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Two comments. One regarding the form, Mr. President, on page 2. I see the word, it starts with resolve to. It looks a little odd to say that we resolve to note. So I would just ask for the deletion of the word resolve and to make the appropriate corrections on all the verbs, because it's the ACP Council of Ministers, so it should read notes, reiterates, expresses, etc. The second comment I want to make, Mr. President, has to do with a little bit of substance. There is one element that has been missing in the negotiations all throughout, and that is the development dimension. Those of us who were present in Lomé for the ACP EU Joint Assembly will recall that we have heard there that the Directorate General for Development is not associated with the negotiations, and most of the negotiations are being carried out by the Division of Trade. So perhaps as a group, the ACP could deplore the fact that there is no involvement of the Directorate General for Development, and therefore we miss out the very important element of development dimension in these discussions. So we could suggest a language for that if this is agreed. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mauritius. Maybe you could proceed with the proposed language.
Thank you. We could add at paragraph 2, a new paragraph 2, where we would say, deplores the lack of involvement of the Directorate General for Development Cooperation in the negotiation process, thus depriving the inclusion of development dimension in the EPA negotiations.
Thank you very much, Mauritius, and we submit that to the Secretariat for the amendment. Trinidad and Tobago, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to follow up on the proposal just made. And in my estimation, the Development Commissioner and his staff, they are involved in the process. And in fact, my delegation raised the point regarding EPA with Mr. Thompson, who earlier from DG Trade, earlier this week, when the senior officials met. And we raised a point relating to the development dimension, in fact. And his response was, well, that's the remit of the DG, the other commissioner. And so therefore he could not really adequately address what I had indicated. So I think that we need clarification on that. And in fact, within the Caribbean, when we were negotiating the EPA, that commission, that Directorate General was in fact involved. Thank you.
May I guide that, with utmost respect, may the two delegations meet and come up with a suitable language for all of us, please. Thank you. Huh? Uganda. Mike.
I thought my voice was loud enough. In number 1, we seem to capture 2 resolutions in one number, in one point, where you say, in this regard, it was recommended, well, you start with note that delay in concluding the negotiations is due to the non-resolution of contentious issues owing to entrenched positions of the EC side. Therefore, the ACP states have to seek ways of convincing the EC negotiators to seriously take into account those concerns, full stop. Then there should be a new resolution. In this regard, it was recommended that a political engagement is necessary, including involving parliamentarians and EU member states. Because in the first point we are noting, and the second one we are recommending. How can you have recommendations and noting in one point? So there should be 2 points.
Thank you, Uganda. I pass that to the Secretariat for note and include the amendment. Since there are no more flags up, the resolution on Economic Partnership Agreement, EPAS, is adopted with the relevant Pardon?
I have another point.
Another one?
Yes.
Okay.
When you read this, the general observation is that we have a very serious omission because we are going to have the joint ACP EU Ministerial Trade Committee on Monday. But we seem to be concentrating on the EC proposal to amend the regulation. The regulation 1528/27. The paragraph on political engagement could also urge the trade ministers to engage with the EU on the contentious outstanding issues with a view to finding mutually acceptable positions. But it doesn't come out. It's not reflected or it's not alluded to in the entire set of resolutions. Then there is another point, point number 7. Reiterate that a decision to implement, but we said the decision. Instead of that, we could say a decision to implement the EPAs by individual countries within a region would, instead of will, would have a serious negative impact. Would, instead of will, have a serious negative impact on the regional integration processes. It's not one process. There are variations. Then, sorry, am I allowed? Or you're
No,
they might think you're favoring me.
No.
Then I thought we could combine 9 and 4 because they seem to carry the same meaning. 4 and 9. Note with apprehension that the ACP states concerned face 2 difficult choices to make, namely, the loss of DFQF, access to the EU market, which could cripple established exporters, or signing of a trade agreement which includes certain unacceptable provisions that limit the space for domestic economic policy making to the detriment of emerging economic sectors and relationships. Then here, in number 9, we say, express concern that failure to ratify would result in a loss of duty-free, quota-free access and reversion to either standard generalized system of preferences, market access conditions, or even in some cases the most favored nation. Why don't we combine 9 and 4? Or because we seem to be talking about the same subject or same issues. Then, sorry, there is another point in number 10. Number 10, or am I moving too fast? Number 10, it's repetitious. You say, further express concern that the proposal further balance of power. We are overusing further. Why don't we start with express concern that the proposal further shifts instead of repeating further in one sentence? Then talking about the negotiations, should we talk about when the negotiations actually started in 2002? In the last sentence, in 10. Since 2000, because they didn't start in 2008. Negotiations. This is born out of the fact that the September 2011 Commission proposal? They didn't start in 2002? They started in 2002.
Consideration of the issue of started in 2003.
Yes, but not 208. Since 208,
I don't know whether Patterson Green was in negotiation.
maybe someone could advise us. Someone could advise us, a technical person.
Par rapport à la question qui est posée par la distinguée ministre de l'Ouganda, évidemment, il est fort possible de prendre en compte les négociations depuis leur phase de lancement en 2002. Mais ici, sous le paragraphe 10, l'insistance est mise sur le processus tel que il s'est développé depuis précisément l'échéance de décembre 2007, qui avait été une échéance de rupture par rapport à une nouvelle phase dans laquelle les négociations entraient. C'est dans ce contexte-là précisément qu'on a mis l'accent sur 2008, parce qu'en décembre 2007, il y avait effectivement le démarrage d'une nouvelle phase à la lumière précisément des arrangements initiaux qui avaient été faits. Maintenant, on ne trouve aucun inconvénient précisément à indiquer 2002 parce que ça couvre finalement l'entièreté du processus de négociation. Donc, de ce point de vue, votre proposition est prise en compte.
Merci beaucoup. Then finally, I'm sorry for being so passionate about this topic. On point number 12. Number 12, you said, quote, reaffirm the ACP unity and solidarity to defend those principles that enhance ACPU partnership. And in this regard, call, not code, call for the immediate withdrawal of the proposed measures in view of the detrimental overall effect. Not called. We'll remove an ED. Then, sorry, number 13, the last sentence. This proposed amendment would adversely affect ACP states which have made a commitment of good faith in the EPA and discourage other states that have embarked on the negotiation process. Seems to be covered in 10. Seems to be repetitious. I seek your advice on this point, because we seem to be repeating ourselves in this sentence, because we're talking about the same issue in number 10. Then finally, the date is written as 21011. Brussels 9th December 21011. It's just a correction. Typographical error. In French it's okay? Well, but we are writing in English. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uganda. Let's have Barbados and thereafter Botswana. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one brief suggestion. The last 3 points are the ones where we are seeking action from the EU, and I wonder whether we shouldn't put them together so that which would mean breaking 12 into 2 parts. We therefore call for the immediate withdrawal of the proposed measures. We assert that they should be maintained until the full EPAs have been concluded, and that the application of EC regulation should be extended to non-LDC ACP states, etc., etc. So that you have the 3 things you are asking EU to do together. Just a suggestion. Perhaps we could have a phrase before. We therefore call, we therefore assert, so and so on, we therefore reiterate. So that the three of them addressed to the EU are together, rather than all over.
Well, I've been promoted to the chair.
It's our pleasure.
Secretariat, please take note that I'm in chair.
Actually, you will be chairing on Monday. So.
Anyway, let me practice. I'll be chairing on Monday. And then all the issues that have been raised, the issue that has been raised by Botswana.
Botswana next. Yeah, Botswana next, sorry. Yeah.
So, Botswana. Then ECOWAS.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Following the very lucid interventions by Uganda, a relook at number 1, in fact, raises a question, and that is with regard to the last sentence, which begins, in this regard, it was recommended that a political engagement is necessary, including involving parliamentarians and EU member states. When you then go right from the beginning, it says ACP Council of Ministers. These are the people who are talking. So who are they recommending to? That was short-lived. So the issue on that one is, if this is a resolution by the Council of Ministers, who is it that they are reporting to that in this regard it was recommended? Who are they recommending to? If they are recommending. That would need to be recast so that it's just a positive statement. Apropos 4 and 9, I just wondered whether these two should be combined or juxtaposed, because they talk about the same thing, but not exactly in the same terms. So the juxtaposition appears to me to be the better way. Let them follow each other. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Botswana. May I invite ECOWAS, please?
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, sur les considérants, le G. Le G où il est dit que, considérant que pour la partie ACP, cette compatibilité est suffisante si elle s'applique uniquement au commerce des marchandises. Je pense que, Monsieur le Président, il y a des pays ici autour de cette table qui ont des intérêts spécifiques sur le commerce des services. À mon avis, le problème de compatibilité porte surtout sur la différence d'interprétation de l'article 24 du GATT et les questions de développement. Ce n'est pas une différence entre le commerce des marchandises et le commerce des services. Il y a beaucoup de pays qui ont pris des clauses de rendez-vous pour négocier les services. Donc, il faut leur rendre justice ici. Il y a des pays également ici, il y a beaucoup de pays qui font du tourisme ou qui comptent sur les secteurs d'activité offshore. Donc il faut leur rendre justice et ne pas voir la compatibilité simplement en termes de commerce de marchandises. Donc je vous proposerai, Monsieur le Président, que le G soit biffé. C'est une proposition. Maintenant, en ce qui concerne le corps du projet, le 1 et le 6 parlent du retard dans la conclusion des négociations. Mais ils donnent des raisons différentes. Dans le 1, on dit que c'est dû aux positions intransigeantes de la partie européenne. Dans le 6, on dit que c'est imputable au non-règlement des questions en suspens. Donc il faut voir comment réconcilier le 1 et le 6 et peut-être remonter le 6 après le 1, parce que là on parle de retard. La dernière page, le 14, c'est pas très clair. Et parce que le règlement 1528 s'applique beaucoup aux non-PMA. Mais quand on dit qu'il faut les élargir aux États ACP non-PMA, donc il y a une petite, en tout cas il y a une difficulté de compréhension. Peut-être qu'il va falloir mieux rédiger le 14. Monsieur le Président, c'est les 3 propositions que je voulais vous faire et je vous remercie.
Could I have thank you very much, ECOWAS. There is some response to suggestions by ECOWAS.
This adequate is talking about the minimum entry point. That's really why it is.
Secretary, could you respond to that, please?
And you should stay.
Par rapport à l'intervention de l'ambassadeur Sow, c'est vrai que le G tel qu'il est libellé peut laisser croire qu'effectivement on ne vise que la couverture du commerce des marchandises dans le cadre précisément de ce projet de résolution ou de la couverture générale par rapport au processus de négociation des APE. Peut-être qu'on pourrait formuler le G dans une perspective qui se fasse l'écho de la discussion qu'il y a eu ici lundi et mardi. Pourquoi? Parce que l'idée qu'il y avait à la base, c'était que, évidemment, en termes de base minimale, on devrait précisément traiter, en fait, de cette compatibilité et de la juger à l'aune précisément du commerce des marchandises comme base minimale. Bon, évidemment, il y a plusieurs autres domaines qui sont couverts dans les négociations et si vous n'y trouvez aucun inconvénient, on peut peut-être le maintenir le G comme tel, mais évidemment, c'était pour tenir compte de certaines vues qui ont été exprimées ici pour dire qu'en termes de socle minimal au moins, il faut précisément qu'on juge en fait de la compatibilité à l'aune précisément du commerce des marchandises. Donc c'est dans ce contexte-là que le G a été formulé. Mais évidemment, on peut l'étendre.
Thank you, Secretariat. Uganda wants to talk on that as well, I think.
We could restructure G to say goods and services, because in economics we always refer to goods and services. It's repetition?
Is that okay? Okay, Secretariat,
Yes.
Secretariat take note of that. Secretariat. Let's have Zambia and then we'll go back again to Botswana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, since Uganda opened the Pandora's box on wording, it may well be useful that apart from the corrections that we've made, may I make reference to item number 11 in the body on having resolved to, and number 11, to stress that the impact of the proposal would shift and remove to B or B2. Stress the impact of the proposal would shift investments from ACP states that do not have full market access to those that have and this would cause friction within the regional organizations. So the proposal is B2 be removed in 11, and in 13, third line, after ACP exports, the new sentence should not read this, but the proposed amendment. And then item 14, again, we're starting with 2 to reiterate that the application of EC Regulation 1528/2007, remove should just be extended, if that's what we sought, subject to the amendment that has just been proposed by ECOWAS. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Zambia. Uganda does close the Pandora's box. It's not open anymore. Botswana, please.
Thank you, Chair. We were quite comfortable with G as is. One of the problems from my little knowledge in this area is that in our region at least, when you want to combine these goods and the services, you run into trouble. So I'd rather, unless it really is going to cause the heavens to collapse, I'd rather we remain with G as it is. That's why we didn't speak about it.
Secretariat.
Monsieur le Président, disons que la proposition faite par l'honorable ministre du Botswana s'inscrit précisément dans l'esprit des discussions techniques qu'il y a eu ici lundi. Donc, évidemment, nous ne trouvons aucun inconvénient à prendre cela en compte, ce d'autant plus que, évidemment, d'un point de vue technique, lorsqu'on passe au commerce des services, ça suppose une autre architecture, une autre préparation, de nouvelles contraintes. Donc, on peut peut-être prendre en compte la proposition de l'honorable ministre de l'Ouganda dans la formulation précisément d'un autre paragraphe qui va couvrir les préoccupations qui sont les siennes. Mais laissez le G tel qu'il apparaît en ce moment.
Thank you very much, Secretariat. Last but not least, just 2 more, Côte d'Ivoire and Fiji. Fiji is there?
Fiji is there.
Yeah. Côte d'Ivoire, please, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le représentant de la CEDEAO avait préconisé qu'on biffe le paragraphe 14. Et je l'ai approché pour lui dire pourquoi ce paragraphe a été libellé ainsi. Si on le biffe, on va pénaliser le Congo, le Gabon et le Nigeria qui sont dans le processus de négociation. C'est un peu pour qu'on prenne en compte les préoccupations de ces 3 pays que le paragraphe 14 a été rédigé. Donc je l'ai approché tout à l'heure après son intervention et il a compris le bien fondé de ce paragraphe-là. Donc il s'agira de le maintenir en état. Merci.
Thank you very much, Côte d'Ivoire, and thank you very much, ECOWAS. I'm grateful. Finally, let's have Fiji.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a very small issue with regards to paragraph 10 in the body. The proposal made by Uganda to change the date from 2008 to 2002. The reason perhaps why 2008 was stated was to reflect the progress made after the deadline of 2007, as the Secretariat had explained, phase 2, and after the interim agreements had been signed, there were still contentious and outstanding issues, and the progress has been made till that date has been substantial, and the EU has to take note of that, the countries that have signed or initialed the interim economic partnership agreement have been negotiating in good faith in trying to resolve some of the outstanding and contentious issues contained in that interim agreement, which they were coerced to sign because of the economic difficulties at that time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Fiji next, please. Thank you very much. Fiji and Uganda. You said you want something?
He finished.
Hmm?
He finished.
Oh, Fiji's finished. Oh. Uganda and then Ghana.
Mr. President, I remember this morning, people made a number of presentations, and most of them were calling for limited EPA, limited ratification. But it's not reflected, it's not alluded to in the recommendations. Most of the countries were saying that we could go ahead while we negotiate other contentious issues. But when you read through all this, there is no reflection to that amongst the recommendations.
Secretariat.
Disons que c'est un aspect sur lequel on va procéder au développement d'un paragraphe. Il faut tout simplement convenir de ce que l'essentiel de ce qui a été pris en compte ici découle des discussions que nous avons eues à partir du rapport de la réunion des experts. Et cet aspect-là précisément va être également pris en compte.
Thank you, Secretariat. Lastly, Ghana, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm only making a recommendation to have a paragraph 15 which would take account of who the resolution is addressed to, in which case we are introducing a paragraph which states, instructs the President of the ACP Council of Ministers to forward the resolution to the Council of the European Union, the European Parliament, and the European Commission, just like it's normally contained in other resolutions that is adopted in these meetings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ghana, for that. I have Trinidad and Tobago with Mauritius have proposed a compromise text on the role of the DG, the Director General of Development in EPA negotiations, and it reads as follows. Emphasizes the importance of active involvement of the EU Directorate General for Development in the EPA negotiation process in order to ensure that the development dimension is fully addressed. I submit that to the Secretariat. Let me thank everybody for the interest and for interventions, the input. in this last resolution, as there have been so many amendments on this resolution. The Secretariat is directed to clean up the draft, take into account all the amendments, and circulate it before Monday's meeting. The draft resolution is passed with all the many amendments. Right, now we move to item 14.
Vanuatu wants the floor to give us some practical information.
Okay, we are number 14, date and venue for the 95th session of the ACP Council of Ministers. May I invite my colleague, the Minister from Vanuatu, to give us a statement, please. Mr. Minister, you're welcome.
Mr. Chairman, Secretary General, Dr. Chambers, thank you very much for yielding me this opportunity to make this short statement relating to the date, the place, the venue, and the 95th session of the ACP Council, as well as the 37th ACP EU Joint Council of Ministers meeting planned for 2012. I wish to officially, through you, sir, inform the August Council that after a series of thorough consultations and dialogue between the ACP and the EU Secretariat on the one hand, and equally within my government and our own constituency on the other, it is my honor and pleasant duty as the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Vanuatu to announce here that the 95th session of the ACP Council of Ministers meeting, to be followed by the 37th session of the ACP EU Joint Council of Ministers, will take place between the 11th to the 15th June, c'est-à-dire 11 au 15 juin 2012, at the Le Lagon Pacific Resort in Port Vila, Vanuatu. Advanced preparations and coordinations of this important and significant event has already started, and a full-time national coordinator of the task force in the name of Mr. Lennox Vuti has been appointed. Mr. Vuti is here with us this evening and will inform the Council by way of an audio-visual presentation on the state of the preparations so far. I wish at this juncture to acknowledge and place on record my government's most profound gratitude and deepest appreciation to the Secretary General of our ACP group of Dr. Mohammed bin Jambas and his staff, as well as the Committee of Ambassadors, for their confidence and support accorded to my country to play host to this very, very significant event. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I now have the pleasure to introduce the coordinator of the National Task Force, Mr. Lennox Vuti, and his team responsible for overseeing and effectively coordinating these 2012 ACP EU events, to run through the Council the state of play so far. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Chairman of the Task Force, please, could you have your presentation, please?
Monsieur le Président, to oblige to the call by my Honorable Foreign Minister to make interventions pursuant to Vanuatu's preparations to hosting the 95th session of the ACP Council, as well as the ACP EU Joint Councils, I wish to preamble my statement as follows. When Vanuatu offered to host the 95th session of the ACP Council and the 37th session of the ACP EU Joint Council in its capital of Port Vila, Vanuatu understands that the meeting will be the largest event with foreign dignitaries ever held in the country, and it accepts that its capacity will be stressed to the limits. I have been asked by the government and the National Task Force to stress to you, Mr. Chairman, delegations and the ACP Secretariat, that Vanuatu remain committed to hosting this event in its capital of Port Vila. The government have consulted with its private sector as regards provision of services for accommodation, telecommunication, transportation, and many other services that are required by delegates to the meetings. Indeed, Vanuatu's private sector indicated a keen interest in providing support for the event, and in particular, the Vanuatu Hotels and Resort Association has reassured government of its commitment of providing every delegate with hotel rooms. The providers of accommodation are making arrangements with their tourist wholesalers, mainly in Australia and New Zealand, in order to accommodate the delegates to the meetings. Our government, through the Council of Ministers, remain committed to hosting this meeting, despite recent and continual Vanuatu's political changes during the past few years. Its commitment is demonstrated by the establishment of the National Task Force chaired by the Foreign Minister, who is present during this 94th session, and deputized by the Director General of the Foreign Ministry. The formation of the National Coordination Office under the portfolio of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and External Trade, an appointment of a full-time national coordinator, the parliamentary appropriation of relevant budgetary allocation for the coordinator, relevant budgetary allocation for this important event, the continual promotion of the event in the media, and Vanuatu's cash commitment to the newly construction of the main plenary Congress Hall by a reputable hotel chain in Vanuatu's capital, Port Vila, goes to demonstrate that commitment. The presence of our Foreign Minister during this 94th session of the ACP Council in Brussels, Mr. Chairman, during which time Vanuatu is experiencing political turbulence, goes to demonstrate to you, the ACP Council and the Secretariat, in my view, is evidence enough of the commitment that Vanuatu accords to its hosting responsibility. The ACP Secretariat, as well as two officials representing the European Commission and the European Council, made an advance visit in August this year to conduct an assessment of Vanuatu's capacity in hosting such an important event, as well as meet government representatives and officials representing focally their Secretariat's requirements, and to experience at first hand the quality level of the services being offered. The government was encouraged by their positive findings, and together we have progressed matters to a level of respect and agreement to enable Vanuatu to hosting the 95th session, as well as the 37th session of the ACP-EU Joint Councils on its shores. While I speak, Mr. Chairman, construction continues on the main plenary conference facility and associated meeting rooms to the standards, dimensions, and specifications as provided by the European Commission, and compliant to Australian and Vanuatu building codes. The materials are being assembled in New Zealand and are being shipped to Vanuatu to be reassembled there with support from 9 expert firms from Indonesia. Construction has been allowed to be carried out 24 hours a day, day and night. It is intended that the main conference hall be completed 1 month prior to the meeting dates to allow for a month's defects detecting period. The main plenary conference hall has been designed to house a 600% capacity at any one time. Mr. Chairman, we anticipate that this facility, with its interiors, including 6 interpretation booths for English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and German, and associated communication networks, will be ready by April 2012. The interpretation booths are being imported from nearby Australia. Mr. Chairman, as required by the ACP Secretariat, 4 interpretation booths will be provided for the ACP meeting from June 11 to 13, 2012, in the main plenary meeting room with dimensions as specified by the European Commission and compliant to ISO 4043/1998. All interpretation equipment used will be compliant to the specifications made under logistical document Rev RS 2011 86718 0808-11 from the European Commission. As part of our preparations, we have created a website specifically for this meeting. A detailed report of Vanuatu's preparations is available through this website. I will now close temporarily by allowing our IT person to present some of the content of the website. Through the website, you will be able to hear live Vanuatu's Prime Minister, welcoming all delegates to the meeting, as well as enjoy some pictures of the meeting venue. Registration/reservation form will also be shown to you, and the list of the hotel accommodation. There are hotel rates and other information that would lead to you making a choice where to stay. As you can see on the screen, that's the list of hotels. You have the room numbers listed, the category of the hotels, level, as well as the room rates. You have also the websites of the named hotels. National Airport, some of the rooms in the Lelago International Resort. You go quick. You take a Prime Minister? Registration. That's the registration form. That's fine. That's the Prime Minister.
Prime Minister of the Republic of Vanuatu. I am privileged to welcome you all, esteemed heads of delegations and distinguished delegates, to the 95th session of the ACP Council of Ministers and the 37th session of the ACP EU Joint Council, to the shores of our beautiful and peaceful island country. Through the Happy Planet Index, our country has been classified 3 years consecutively since the index has been introduced as the happiest place on earth. The warmth of our people, their natural smiles and friendliness will demonstrate to you an assurance of a rewarding experience. Our country's motto, "In God we stand," assures you of our lifestyle to be consistent with our Christian principles and custom values. Our national constitution, however, ensured a freedom to worship environment, enabling other religions to find their way into our society, living in harmony side by side. This is the way the world should be. I will look forward to meeting you in Port Vila, our capital, and with all sincerity, ask you to take time to visit our islands and places outside of Port Vila, to be able to fully appreciate the beauty of our islands and its friendly people. Welcome. By Milukimiu, from Port Vila. Thank you, Thomas.
Mr. Chairman, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Vanuatu awaits you. Come and enjoy the comfort of the islands and experience the happiest place on the planet. See you in Vanuatu in 2012. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Chairman of the Task Force. Thank you very much, my colleague Minister from Vanuatu. The Council congratulates the host country, Vanuatu, for hosting, looking forward to hosting these important meetings. And we all look forward to being in Port Vila. We all look forward to being in the happiest place on earth. Thank you very much. We're running out of time, completely out of time. The last item is the interpreters have warned me that they're walking out. In any case, we only now have any other business, but unfortunately, there are some people who have indicated lately that they wanted to contribute to any other business, but at the beginning of this meeting, I did open the floor, and there was nobody showed an interest. Therefore, I ruled that there is nothing for any other business. But finally, there are some administrative arrangements I'd like to make clear here. First, under item number 10, certain delegates made written presentations. Under item number 10 in the agenda, item number 10 was trade matters. There was the status of EPAS, and then there was B, preparation for WTO ministerial meetings. Under item number 10, certain delegates made written presentations. The Secretariat would appreciate if these written presentations could be made available to them. Others who did not have written presentations but would wish to present their statements in writing to the Secretariat are also encouraged to do so. So that is in relation to item number 10. May I ask the Secretary General to make an announcement, and then I will conclude.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, this relates to arrangements for the meeting on Monday, that is the 10th Joint ACP-EC Ministerial Committee meeting. We have received a statement or directives from the Commission, which we would like to share with honorable ministers and delegations. In fact, we have said it, but just for avoidance of doubt, if you permit me, I will quickly go through it. It says the 10th Joint ACP-EC Ministerial Committee meeting will be held on Monday, 12 December 2011 at 14:30 at the Center Brochette. Access badges will be provided at the entrance of the Center Brochette. No parking facility available. Upon arrival at the Center Brochette, EC and ACP personnel will be present to guide the ministers to the meeting room, that is room 0/A. A maximum of 3 delegates per country and 2 per rec will be allowed. It will be appropriate if the ACP delegates arrived half an hour earlier in order to avoid last-minute rush. Thank you. Now, the second announcement is an invitation being extended by yours sincerely, my humble self, to delegates to join us for a cocktail when we rise from here. I do not intend to disrupt the celebration of Jamhuriya Day of Kenya, so maybe we'll have quick drinks, and those who want to go ahead to the Kenyan National Day will be able to do so. Thank you. But you're invited for a cocktail after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Colleague ministers, this concludes our deliberation for the present session. I believe that each of these sessions contribute to bring the ACP family closer. The edification of the ACP family demands the best of all of us. Ambition and imaginations in vision, humility and tenacity in work. Our other eyes are watching us, but ultimately we judge ourselves. If we are to share a common destiny, we must each assume our responsibilities. The task ahead of us is not an easy one, but one from which we are not at liberty to abstain. The world is becoming impatient for change. The ACP has got to realign and change with the times. The expectations from our communities are increasing daily. The protests, demonstrations in the Middle East, Wall Street, and Moscow, where else we watch them on our televisions, today will soon be on our doorsteps. If we do not move fast to change with times. The time for talking and just talking has got to come to an end. The time to walk the talk is here with us now. I urge colleague ministers to attempt and endeavor to attend ACP and ACU meetings as frequently as they can amongst the heavy and important schedules. I urge my colleague ministers and ambassadors to urge the capitals to publish the importance of the ACP. I urge my colleague ministers and ambassadors to raise to the principals the importance of the ACP, AU conferences, and more importantly, I urge colleague ministers, distinguished ambassadors, that as we work towards the summit next year, we all ask our principals to endeavor amongst the heavy duties to make attempts to attend the summit, the next 7th summit. I'd like to record my gratitude to you all for attending this meeting and enriching the debate with your valuable contributions. You have in this way made my task all the more agreeable. I believe that we have worked in a very constructive manner. Our sincere thanks go to, and my sincere thanks go to the Secretary General, Dr. Chambers, for his cooperation and assistance and enabling us to have an environment to which to do our job and business efficiently and effectively, and to the ACP Secretariat for their constant support and dedication, for all their full collaboration, which has enabled us to conduct our meeting successful. I thank the interpreters for their patience and tolerance, and also I give my appreciation to other support staff. My term as president of Council of Ministers come to an end on the 1st of February. I will not seek an amendment of the Constitution to extend my term, nor will I resist to step down. I'll pass over the office to St. Lucia peacefully. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you a safe trip back home. Since the holiday season is about to start, allow me to wish you all a Merry Christmas and a peaceful and prosperous New Year. For those who do not celebrate Christmas like Dr. Chambers, we welcome them to our homes. The 94th session of the ACP Council of Ministers stand adjourned. Thank you.
I'll be there before you know it. I'll be there before you know it.
Thank you.
Well done.
Congratulations, sir.
Thank you.